There are moments in life when the smallest act of disrespect spirals into a full-blown neighborhood war, and this story is exactly that. Imagine stepping outside your front door, ready to head out for work, or maybe just a quick errand, only to find that your driveway, the one you paid for, the one attached to your own property, is completely blocked, and not just by any car, but by the same neighbor who has made it her personal mission to test your patience time and time again. That is exactly what happened to me, and what started as a simple inconvenience quickly escalated into one of the most unbelievable showdowns I've ever experienced. It began on an otherwise ordinary Saturday morning, the kind of morning where the sun had just started peeking over the rooftops and the street was still quiet. I had plans for the day, and like anyone else, I counted on being able to use my own driveway. But when I walked outside, there it was, her car, Karen's car, parked directly across my driveway as if it were her own private parking spot. Now, this wasn't the first time Karen had pulled something like this. She had a reputation in the neighborhood. Everyone knew she was difficult, entitled, and always seemed to think the rules didn't apply to her. But parking directly in front of my driveway, that crossed a line. I stood there for a moment, staring at her vehicle, feeling my blood pressure rise. At first, I thought maybe she had just made a mistake, maybe she was visiting someone, or maybe she'd only be there for a few minutes. But as time passed, it became very clear. She had no intention of moving her car. The worst part? She lived only a few houses down. She had her own driveway, her own space, but for some twisted reason, she decided that parking in front of mine was her right. I tried to remain calm because the last thing I wanted was to start some ugly scene that would drag in the entire neighborhood. But as the minutes turned into hours, I realized Karen wasn't just being careless. She was testing me. She wanted to see what I would do, to push my patience until I snapped. What made it worse was that I had somewhere important to be that day. I had scheduled an appointment across town, and leaving on time wasn't optional. Yet there I was, locked into my own home because of her blatant disregard. I paced the driveway, checking the street every few minutes, hoping she would come out and move her car, but she didn't. By noon, frustration had fully settled in. My plans were ruined, and my mood had shifted from mild annoyance to absolute anger. I wasn't the type to cause conflict, but this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about respect, about boundaries, and Karen had made it clear she didn't care about either. The neighborhood wasn't exactly peaceful to begin with. Our street had long been under the watchful eye of the HOA, and while some people appreciated their presence, others, like me, often found them more of a nuisance than a help. They claimed to enforce the rules fairly, but in reality, they often turned a blind eye to certain people, especially the ones who knew how to manipulate the system. Karen was one of those people. She always seemed to get away with things that others would be fined for in an instant. That's why I knew the HOA wouldn't help me. Reporting her to them would be pointless. They'd drag their feet, maybe send a polite warning letter weeks later, and by then, the problem would be long over. No, I needed a solution, and I needed it now. As the sun shifted higher in the sky, I weighed my options. I could confront her directly, but that would no doubt lead to a heated argument, and knowing Karen, she would twist the story to make me the bad guy. I could call the police, but I doubted they would prioritize something like a blocked driveway, especially with more serious calls flooding in on a weekend. And then, the answer hit me. A tow truck. The thought alone made me smirk. The idea of watching her face as her car was lifted off the ground and hauled away. It was poetic justice. She thought the street belonged to her, but the law said otherwise. Parking in front of someone's driveway was illegal, plain and simple. I didn't need to argue with her, I didn't need to beg the HOA, and I didn't need to wait around hoping she'd eventually move. I could solve the problem with one phone call. But even as I reached for my phone, there was a hesitation. Tow trucks weren't cheap, and once her car was hauled away, Karen was going to come after me with everything she had. She'd cry to the HOA, complain to the neighbors, maybe even try to harass me directly. Still, I realized I had to take a stand. If I didn't, she would keep doing this. She'd block my driveway again and again just to prove she could. So, I made the call. The operator on the other end listened as I explained the situation. A car blocking a private driveway, the owner refusing to move it, the repeated nature of the offense. They assured me a tow truck would be dispatched as soon as one was available. My heart raced as I hung up, knowing there was no going back now. Minutes felt like hours as I waited. Every sound from the street made me think it was the tow truck arriving. I kept glancing toward Karen's house, half expecting her to come out and move the car before they got there. But she didn't. She stayed hidden inside, oblivious to the fact that her little act of defiance was about to backfire in the most spectacular way. Finally, the tow truck appeared. The massive vehicle turned onto the street with a loud rumble, and I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. Justice was about to be served. The driver hopped out, took one look at the situation, and immediately nodded. He knew the drill. Paperwork was checked, photos were taken, and within minutes, the process began. Chains clinked against metal, gears groaned, and slowly but surely, Karen's car began to lift off the pavement. Watching it happen was surreal. The vehicle that had held me hostage all day was now dangling helplessly in the air, completely out of her control. I couldn't stop the grin spreading across my face. After hours of frustration, it felt like victory. But just as the car tilted onto the tow truck's bed, the front door of Karen's house burst open. She came storming out, arms flailing, her voice carrying across the street. She shouted accusations, demanded explanations, and insisted that what I was doing was illegal. But it was too late. The driver was just doing his job, and the paperwork was already in order. Her car wasn't going to sit in my driveway anymore. It was heading straight to the impound lot. Her outrage only made the moments sweeter. Neighbors began peeking through their curtains, some even stepping outside to watch. The same people who had suffered from her behavior in the past were now witnessing her downfall, and the looks on their faces told me they were enjoying it just as much as I was. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. Karen wasn't the type to let something like this go. She would see this as a challenge, a battle line drawn in the sand. And if I thought blocking my driveway was bad, I could only imagine what kind of revenge she was already plotting. Still, as the tow truck rumbled down the street with her car in tow, I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. For once, she had been forced to face the consequences of her actions, and I had stood my ground. Little did I know, the war with Karen had only just begun. When the tow truck disappeared down the street with her car strapped tightly to its bed, I thought the worst was behind me. The driveway was clear, my property rights were respected again, and Karen had been put in her place. But anyone who has ever dealt with someone like her knows that it's never that simple. You don't embarrass a person who thrives on control without sparking retaliation. And Karen was the type of neighbor who would never forget, never forgive, and certainly never let something like this slide. The very next morning I realized the storm was only just beginning. I woke up to the sound of loud knocks at my door. At first I thought maybe it was a delivery, but when I opened the blinds I saw a clipboard and a badge. Standing on my porch was a representative from the HOA holding a stack of papers. My stomach sank. Karen had wasted no time. Less than 24 hours after her car had been towed, she had already filed a formal complaint against me with the HOA, and not just one complaint, an entire laundry list of alleged violations. The representative explained, in the most monotone voice possible, that my house had been flagged for multiple infractions, ranging from unsightly trash cans left too close to the curb, to overgrown grass, to the absurd claim that my car had oil stains on the driveway that were lowering the neighborhood's property value. Every accusation was laughable, My yard was neatly maintained, my trash cans were tucked away, and my driveway was spotless. But Karen knew exactly what she was doing. She was manipulating the system, using the HOA as her weapon. She couldn't stop the tow truck from taking her car, but she could drag me through endless bureaucracy, hoping to bury me under warnings and fines. I stood there, listening to the representative drone on about the serious nature of these complaints, and all I could think about was how fast Karen had acted. She must have stayed up all night, digging through the rule book, looking for anything she could use against me. And the fact that the HOA had actually entertained her claims was infuriating. They didn't care about fairness or evidence. They cared about paperwork and technicalities. Over the next week, it became clear that Karen was on a mission. Every day, I'd come home from work to find a new letter taped to my door. Each one was a fresh notice of violation, threatening fines if I didn't correct the problem. One day, it was about the color of my fence. Another day, it was about the position of my mailbox. And another day, it was about the length of the grass by the sidewalk, even though I had just mowed it the day before. It was relentless. She was trying to break me down, to make me regret ever calling that tow truck. And I'll admit, there were moments when I wondered if maybe I had made a mistake. Not because she was right, but because the stress of fighting her constant attacks was wearing me thin. But the thing about Karen was that she didn't know when to stop. If she had simply left me alone after the first couple of complaints, maybe I would have ignored her, paid a fine or two, and tried to move on. But she pushed too hard, too fast, and in doing so, she made it personal. I started documenting everything, every notice from the HOA, every interaction with their representatives, every petty accusation she lobbed my way. I kept it all. I took photos of my yard, time-stamped videos of my driveway, and even saved copies of the letters. If she wanted a war, I was going to fight back with evidence. And it wasn't just me who noticed her behavior. Other neighbors started to get dragged into her chaos as well. One of them confided to me that Karen had begun complaining about their barking dog. Another said she accused them of violating noise ordinances because their kids played basketball in the driveway. It became clear that her vendetta against me had spilled over into a campaign of control against the entire block. Soon, the neighborhood felt divided. On one side were the people who had dealt with Karen's antics before and sympathized with me. On the other were the few who feared her wrath and chose to stay silent, hoping she wouldn't target them next. And right in the middle was the HOA, happy to stir the pot as long as it meant collecting fines and asserting authority. But Karen wasn't satisfied with just harassing me through paperwork. One evening, as I pulled into my freshly cleared driveway, I noticed something strange. My mailbox door was bent, hanging awkwardly as if it had been kicked. At first, I thought maybe it was just an accident, maybe a delivery truck had clipped it, but deep down I knew. It was Karen. She was escalating from paperwork to vandalism. That same week, I found scratches along the side of my car. They weren't deep, but they were obvious. Again, no proof, no witnesses, but all signs pointed to her. She wanted me rattled. She wanted me to know she wasn't done. The breaking point came a few nights later. It was close to midnight when I heard shouting outside. At first I ignored it, assuming it was just some late-night commotion, but then I recognized her voice. Karen was standing in the street, pointing at my house, yelling about how I was ruining the neighborhood and how she would get rid of me one way or another. Lights flicked on up and down the block as neighbors peeked through their blinds, whispering to each other. She was making a fool of herself, but she didn't care. This wasn't about logic, it was about control, about intimidation. That's when I realized something important. Karen didn't just want revenge. She wanted to make an example out of me. She wanted the entire neighborhood to see that if you crossed her, she would come after you with everything she had. But here's the thing about people like Karen. They always overplay their hand, and in her desperation to destroy me, she was leaving behind a trail of evidence, a pattern of harassment so obvious that it couldn't be ignored forever. I knew I couldn't rely on the HOA to protect me. If anything, they were enjoying the fines and attention too much to care about fairness. But I could rely on the truth. I had photos, videos, timestamps, and witnesses, and sooner or later, her behavior was going to catch up with her. As the days dragged on, I started to prepare for the inevitable showdown. Karen thought she had me cornered, buried under a mountain of violations and neighborhood gossip, but in reality, she was building a case against herself, brick by brick, tantrum by tantrum. The night before the next HOA meeting, I laid out all my evidence on the table, neatly organized folders, photos printed and labeled, recordings ready to play. If Karen wanted a war, then the meeting would be the battlefield. And this time, I wouldn't just defend myself, I would expose her for the bully she truly was. Because this wasn't just about my driveway anymore. It was about showing everyone in the neighborhood that Karen's reign of entitlement was over. And as I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I knew one thing for sure. Tomorrow was going to change everything. The night of the HOA meeting arrived like the calm before a storm. The community hall was filled with that uneasy buzz of whispered conversations, the kind that makes you feel like something big is about to happen. Neighbors sat scattered across folding chairs, some leaning forward with curiosity, others crossing their arms defensively. Everyone knew why the room was so full that night. Word had spread quickly, and the whole block had gathered to see what would unfold. At the front of the room sat the HOA board members, shuffling papers and pretending to be neutral. But I could see it in their eyes, half boredom, half hunger. They thrived on this kind of drama. For them, conflict meant power, and they loved nothing more than watching neighbors tear each other apart while they got to play judge and jury. And then there was Karen. She strutted into the room like a queen entering her court, her chin high, her expressions smug. She carried a folder stuffed with papers, no doubt filled with her complaints and fabricated evidence against me. She made sure to make eye contact with me as she passed, her smirk practically screaming that she thought she had already won. The meeting began with the usual formalities, minutes from the last session, a brief update on landscaping projects, the standard runaround. But everyone in that room was waiting for the same thing, the dispute. Finally, the chairperson cleared his throat and announced that a matter of ongoing conflict between two homeowners would be addressed. All eyes turned toward me and Karen. Karen wasted no time. She launched into her tirade with the confidence of someone who had practiced it in front of a mirror for hours. She painted me as a careless, disrespectful neighbor who ignored the rules and lowered the value of everyone's homes. She rattled off her list of alleged violations, pointing dramatically at her stack of papers as if sheer volume proved her case. The board members nodded along, taking notes, and for a brief moment I wondered if maybe her performance would sway them. She was loud, animated, and relentless, exactly the kind of spectacle they secretly enjoyed. But then it was my turn. I stood up slowly, carrying my own neatly organized folder. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from adrenaline. I wasn't here to argue. I was here to expose the truth. I started with the basics, photos of my yard, my driveway, my trash cans, all neatly maintained. Each picture was time-stamped, each one disproving her claims one by one. As I laid them out on the table for everyone to see, the smugness on her face began to falter. Then I presented the letters. Dozens of violation notices she had triggered within days of the tow incident. I pointed out the timeline, how suspiciously fast and frequent the complaints had come in, and how they all originated right after her car was removed. The pattern was impossible to ignore. But the real turning point came when I pulled out the videos. On my phone, I had recordings of my yard, taken the very same days I supposedly violated the rules. In one clip, I walked the property line, showing a freshly mowed lawn. In another, I panned across my driveway, spotless and free of oil stains. Each video contradicted her claims in undeniable detail. The room grew restless. Neighbors leaned forward, whispering to each other. Some even chuckled under their breath, realizing just how far Karen had stretched the truth. The HOA board shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that they might have been played as pawns in her vendetta. And then came the final blow. I produced photos of the vandalism, the bent mailbox, the scratches on my car, and reminded the board of the night she stood in the street screaming threats at me. Several neighbors nodded, confirming they had witnessed her outburst. It was no longer just my word against hers, it was a pattern of harassment, and everyone in the room could see it. Karen tried to interrupt, shouting that I was lying, that I was framing her, but her voice cracked under the weight of her unraveling facade. The more she protested, the guiltier she looked. Her once confident demeanor collapsed into frantic desperation, her words becoming less coherent with each passing minute. By the time I finished, the room was silent. The board members shuffled their papers nervously, clearly embarrassed by how easily they had been manipulated. For once, they had no smug remarks, no threats of fines. They couldn't deny the evidence sitting in front of them. The chairperson finally cleared his throat and muttered something about reviewing the situation further before moving on to the next agenda item. It was their way of avoiding outright admitting they had been wrong, but the message was clear. Karen's reign of harassment was over. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors began to approach me. Some offered quiet words of support. Others simply gave me nods of approval. It was subtle, but it felt like a shift. People were no longer afraid of Karen. They had seen her exposed, stripped of her intimidation tactics, and they knew she wasn't untouchable anymore. Karen, on the other hand, stormed out of the room without a word. Her face was flushed, her folder clutched tightly to her chest, her pride shattered. For someone who thrived on control, losing it in front of the entire neighborhood was the worst punishment imaginable. In the days that followed, things changed dramatically. The violation notices stopped. The HOA, perhaps embarrassed by how easily they had been used, seemed to back off entirely. My yard, my driveway, my mailbox, all left alone. The quiet was almost unsettling at first, but slowly it began to feel like peace. Karen, of course, didn't apologize. People like her never do. But she kept her distance. Her car was never again parked near my driveway. She stopped screaming in the street, stopped sending the HOA after me, and for the most part, she disappeared into the background. It was as if the humiliation of that meeting had finally deflated her sense of power. And the neighborhood? It felt lighter. Without her constant drama dominating the block, people began to relax again. Kids played in driveways without fear of complaints, dogs barked without mysterious notes appearing in mailboxes, and for the first time in a long time, the street actually felt like a community instead of a battlefield. Looking back, it's almost funny how it all started, with one blocked driveway. What seemed like a small inconvenience had spiraled into a full-blown war, but in the end, it exposed the truth about Karen and her endless entitlement. Sometimes it takes standing your ground to remind people like her that they don't own the world around them. And as for me, every time I pull into my clear, unobstructed driveway, I can't help but smile. Because that one tow truck didn't just remove her car, it removed her power.